In this video, I'm going to be talking about gradients within Photoshop. I'm going to go over what they are and how to create one, and I'm also going to go over 4 popular uses for your gradients within Photoshop. So let's go ahead and hop right into the program so I could show you what a gradient is. Now, the first thing you're going to want to do is find the gradient tool on the toolbar, and it is located right here. If you don't see it, it could be also hidden under the paint bucket tool. So you can just go ahead and select that if you see that. So now that we're on the gradient tool here, you can see that this options bar is now going to give us a bunch of options for gradients. So let's start with the most basic gradient. Let's go to the basics panel here and select this middle one right here, which is going to be a black fading to nothing. And then we're going to click this one right here, which is a linear gradient. So now you can see if I draw a line along here, it's going to create this gradient of black to white in this image here. The smaller you draw the gradient, the smaller the gradient's going to be. If you draw bigger, it's going to go ahead and make that much bigger and more spread out. This also can be applicable for the circular gradient here. So say we draw from here, it's now going to create a circular gradient based off of where you start your initial line. So those are the 2 most popular gradients you're going to be using. There's also a few others here, but I haven't really found many uses for them in photography. So the main thing I use gradients for is for creating and editing masks. They're very good at being able to control the adjustments where you want them, which leads me into the first main reason that you might use a gradient in Photoshop, and that is for creating vignettes. So a vignette is essentially a circular gradient along the outside of the image that gets darker as you get to the edges. The benefit of using a vignette in the image is that it helps draw the eye towards the center of the image, and it also adds a little bit of surrealism to the image. Some people are more particular about using vignettes than others. I prefer to use them in almost every single image I use. So let's go ahead and hop in and let me show you how to create a vignette. So the first thing you're going to do is create an adjustment layer. I prefer to use the curves one. Alternatively, you could also do this with a levels or a contrast, but curves has the most flexibility here. So let's go ahead and create that. The next thing you're going to do is turn the blend mode to multiply. So now we have this much darker layer going over the top of this here. In order to fix this, we're going to go ahead and use the gradient tool to create a mask here. So we have the gradient tool selected, we have the circular gradient selected, and now all we got to do is make sure we're on black paint, and we can go ahead and draw a circle right in the middle here that's going to create a mask gradient for us. So as you can see, that did a pretty good job. Unfortunately, I want to make it a bit bigger here, so I'm going to go ahead and hit undo there, and then I'm going to go ahead and draw a little bit longer here. So now we have a much more spread out gradient. Another thing I could do to fine tune that is hit this opacity button to really get that gradient dialed in where I want it to. Now there you have it. We have a perfect gradient. So now as you can see, if we click on this mask and make it full screen, it's essentially just a circular gradient within that mask there. Another thing you can do is you can go in and edit that gradient mask. So say I didn't want the gradient under this part of the waterfall here. I could go in and create my paintbrush here. And since it's on black, we can now go through and start painting the black right here, and it will remove that gradient from this part of the image here, as you can see it right there. So now the gradient vignette is only along this outskirt edge right here. So this is really great if you have parts of the image that you don't want to be vignetted. Another thing you can do if you don't like that vignette is I can go through and just simply delete this mask. So I can then go ahead and create another mask and start from scratch. The reason you might end up doing this is because once you create a vignette in here, you can't edit it unless you undo or delete that. So if I were to try and draw again over that, it's simply going to create a bigger circle and keep adding to that mask right there. So therefore, to start from scratch, you either got to delete or undo. And that is how you create a vignette. So let's go ahead and hop to the second reason you might want to use a gradient in Photoshop, which is for spotlight. A spotlight is essentially the exact opposite of a vignette. It's where you draw some kind of circle or selection around an area that you want to lighten up a bit, perhaps to draw the eye to that area. So let's go ahead and hop into Photoshop here, and let me go ahead and show you how to do that. So we're gonna go ahead and create a new layer adjustment, the curves one, except this time we're gonna hit screen as the blend mode instead of multiply. Now we're gonna go ahead and do the same thing. We're gonna create a mask right where we want to brighten up. And I wanna brighten up this little plant right here. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna invert this mask here, and we're gonna switch to white paint because we only want this area to have that white circle. So there you go. Now we got a nice little spotlight on this area here. Say I want to make that a little bit smaller, I could go ahead and do that, or maybe something more like right in the center there, like that. So now I could go through and refine that a little bit there, and there we go, a perfect spotlight. So again, as you can see, if I were to make this mask full screen, you can see the gradient is right there on the image. So let's go ahead and hop to the third reason that you might want to use a gradient in your Photoshop, which is for emphasizing or pulling out the sun. So let's hop to this image here and say I want to brighten up this sun a little bit. Maybe I want this orange to glow a bit more and really pop it out. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create a color balance layer this time. The reason we're doing this is so that we can up those reds and those yellows to make that sun a bit more illuminated. So now let's go through and adjust this yellow a little bit, maybe adjust this red, and get this fine-tuned to where we want it. So that's about the color I want, except now I want to get that area only right here using a circular gradient in a mask. So we got our mask here, circular gradient selected. Let's go ahead and invert this layer here and make sure we're on white paint. And now we're gonna go ahead and paint a little circular gradient mask right here. There we go. So now, as you can see, that color adjustment is only being applied up here. Now I can go through and brighten that sun and get the color fine-tuned if I really need to. So that's one way to light up the sun. This is particularly useful for waterfalls, where perhaps you're in a forest and you want to have a little bit of light source coming from above. You can start to add and pull out that color a little bit to provide a little bit of contrast to the image. Now let's cut to the fourth reason you might want to use a gradient in Photoshop, and that is for fading out the edges. So essentially what this means is creating a linear gradient down to help de-emphasize a certain part of an image. Let me show you what I mean. So let's go ahead and delete this layer here. And this time we're going to go ahead and make sure we have the linear gradient selected. So now what we're going to go ahead and do is go up and create a curves adjustment. Again, you could also use a brightness contrast or a level. It honestly just depends on whatever's easiest for you. So now what we're going to do is create a curves adjustment here. We're going to switch the blend mode to multiply again. So now the object with this image is to de-emphasize this part of the image here. So we're going to go ahead and create a linear mask, making sure this is selected, and draw along right here. So now, as you can see, this area is being darkened out a bit. So I'm going to go ahead and decrease the opacity there. And we want it to be subtle. We don't want it to be too much. So there we go. So now we are able to darken this area down here and pull the eye up in this direction a bit more using this linear gradient. So now, as you can see, if we make this gradient full screen, this is what it actually looks like on the mask. So that's the 4 ways that you might use gradients in Photoshop. Again, they all pertain to editing and creating masks. Now, What happens if you want a bit more of a specific gradient within Photoshop? Obviously, these two tools here, the linear and the radial, are a little bit limited and they don't allow you to make that precise of a selection to gradient out. So let me go ahead and show you a tip to make a gradient mask that's a little bit different than we've been doing before. So we're going to go ahead and start with the lasso tool here because this is going to give us the most flexibility of the spot that we want to create a gradient with. So let's go ahead and draw a little bit of a circle here like that. Say we only want the gradient or vignette to happen along these lines here. So now what we're going to do is we're going to create a curves adjustment here, and it's going to automatically apply that selection to the mask here. So we're going to go ahead and invert that, and we're going to convert this layer to multiply. So now, as you can see, we have this line here, but now it's just not gradiented out. It's not feathered, it doesn't blur, it doesn't look nice. So in order to fix this, we're going to go ahead and pop up to filters. So we're going to click filter here, and we're going to go to blur, and we're going to do a Gaussian blur. And the higher you make this radius, the more it's going to blur those edges here. So as you can see, you can get more and more blurry with that edge. I found the sweet spot to be about 420, so we're going to keep it at that. And now we have a custom made gradient or vignette for this image here. Now you could use this filter blur technique on any of the reasons I've showed you before, such as for the sun emphasis or a spotlight or even the edge fade if you want to get a bit more particular with it. So that's one way you can get very, very specific with the gradient that you want to have. So one more thing that I wanted to mention while we're talking about gradients is the gradients adjustment. Now if we go down here to adjustments and hit gradient here, what this is going to do is it's going to create a whole new layer over the top of all of our other layers. I honestly don't use this feature very much, but I did want to explain it briefly while we're talking about gradients. So within this menu, you can go through and click a more specific gradient. Perhaps you want to hop into these oranges here and click this one here. As you can see, this is going to go ahead and create a gradient layer over the top of the other one. Some people like to blend this into their layers if you want to get a bit funky with the colors here. You can also edit this gradient by double-clicking here and then double-clicking on that option right there. This is going to take us to the gradient editor. So here we can now drag how much red we want in the image, or alternatively how much yellow we want in the image, or we can adjust the middle point here. And there's a few other options for adjusting smoothness and the type of gradient that you want. You can also go in and select different colors. So say I wanted to use this one instead, I can swap to that color there. So like I said, I rarely use this feature of Photoshop here with the gradient adjustment layer, but it is there if you do need it. Perhaps if you're creating flyers or looking just for a more fun photo, not necessarily something that looks realistic, that could be a great option. So with that being said, those are all of the uses for gradients that I have within Photoshop. Let's go ahead and hop to another video.